cosmic. Have you ever wondered why we have certain scripture readings on certain Sundays? Well, of course you have. It's not by chance, and it's not because I wake up on Sunday morning and say to myself, gee whiz, I really have a hankering to talk about the Good Samaritan today. The Christian church, and the big way that we think about the Christian church and Christianity, is particular days on the calendar to celebrate or to remind us of things. To facilitate that, it's been a long-standing practice in the Catholic Church, and in some, not all, some Protestant traditions to use something that we call the lectionary. Lectionary is simply a list of suggested readings that have been deemed to be appropriate for any given day of the year, including Sundays. Current version of the lectionary that we employ was developed in 1992, fairly recent. But like any tool, the lectionary can take on the aura of an ironclad rule that must not, cannot be broken, or horrible things might occur. In other words, you must only use these scriptures and none other because Jesus said so, apparently. But like any rule, it's consistently broken. There's nothing requiring us to pay any attention at all to the lectionary. We use it mostly because it can come in pretty handy sometimes, so why not? Now, if there's a problem with the lectionary, it's usually during the months roughly between April and November, and that's a big chunk of the year. It's during that time when the readings we hear from the Bible are not really tied together to any particular occasion or linked to any particular liturgy. So in other words, they're not thematically lined up with the prayers and the other words spoken and the actions performed to mark a special occasion. Because that's what a liturgy is. It's the roadmap for any kind of religious observance. And by observance, I mean a special day or a holiday. But between December and April, more or less, that's where the rubber hits the road, lectionarily speaking. Things tend to get a lot more specific because within that time frame is when we have almost every Christian observance. For instance, December 25th, we have Christmas. You probably heard that before. And the lectionary readings are, no surprise, about the birth of Jesus. The 4 weeks leading up to Christmas are known as the season of Advent. So the readings, in one way or another, are designed to help prepare us for and to joyfully anticipate Christmas. The readings during the season of Lent and Easter are also pretty consistent, but pinning down the date for Easter, that can feel like it requires a degree in orbital mechanics. Get this, Easter, see if you might need to take notes, is that Easter is the first Sunday after the full moon that occurs on or after the spring equinox. But if that full moon, known as the Paschal moon, falls on a Sunday, then Easter is the following Sunday. And that's only if you're using the Gregorian calendar, not the Julian calendar employed by the Eastern Orthodox churches. So now you know how to schedule Easter if you're ever called upon to do that. Whenever Christian holidays occur, most of them are very long established, determined centuries ago. But one notable exception is Christ the King Sunday. Not every church observes Christ the King Sunday, but for those who do, it is celebrated every year on the last Sunday before the season of Advent begins, and today is that Sunday. Christ the King Sunday was only established back in 1925 by Pope Pius XI. So by Christian holiday standards, it's just a little baby. To give birth to this special observance, Pope Pius issued what was called a papal encyclical, which was and still is a way for the Pope to get across to people a teaching on a social issue. It's a big deal. For example, the current Pope, Francis, has been in office since 2013, and he's only issued 3 encyclicals. And I have yet to issue any at all. So why was Pope Pius XI moved to issue one in 1925? Well, he was dismayed by the rapid growth of secularism, atheism, fascism, and communism. Mostly, he wanted to challenge the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe and other places, Italy particularly, which overtly denigrated religious beliefs. It was an amazing time in history we can often gloss over. But think about it. In 1925, World War I had ended only 11 years, or 7 rather, years before. That war and its aftermath exposed the crazy futility and greed, moral rot of the governments that perpetuated that human tragedy, where over 20 million people lost their lives. In 1925, people were still attempting to recover from that war and figure out how things could have ever gone so sideways. It made people question everything about modern society. A wave of revolutions and political unrest had turned the world upside down during the war and for several years following. And all that geopolitical drama had an enormous impact on traditional institutional religion. People began to question the validity of the church and its role in society, and not just the Catholic Church. Like any institution, in times of great social change, churches can come under scrutiny, and people can justifiably ask where the church's authority even comes from and whether it's right to keep recognizing the church as having any relevance whatsoever. So those were the social trends blowing in the wind when Pope Pius XI issued the encyclical establishing a Sunday called Christ the King. In a nutshell, it affirms that in a world where kingdoms come and go, and where people are abandoning their long-held allegiances to institutions, including churches, there is something more enduring than anything, and that is the authority and the kingship of Jesus Christ. Pope Pius specifically warned that in a world where many people and governments had chosen to do away with acknowledging Christ as king, the prospects for peace among nations in the future were not good. Could be Pius was something of a prophet. He died 14 years later at the same year that World War II began. Now, when we read about the establishment Christ the King Sunday, the words authority and kingship can stand out to our modern ears and maybe sound a little bit controlling. Maybe not surprising coming from someone who's a pope. But by all accounts, Pope Pius was a genuinely good and benevolent man and leader. And even though he viewed the Catholic Church as the instrument and embodiment of Christ in the world, we can get past that little detail and look at his encyclical more broadly. He was advocating for something that we affirm every time that we gather here. And that is to understand that as people of faith, we are called and we're compelled to navigate the world with our eyes and our ears and our hearts tuned into the frequency of God's love as we have seen and heard it made real through a first century rabbi named Jesus. To acknowledge that Christ is king is another way of saying that despite anyone's nationality, despite anyone's race, anyone's politics, anyone's sexual orientation, anyone's wealth, anyone's education, anyone's ability, we all belong to each other and we're all responsible for each other. Because the love of God knits us all together in one big human family. And saying Christ affirms reality, even, and maybe especially when we see that our very human efforts to make things better and safer and saner in a fractured and hurting world don't often go so well. In light of that harsh worldly reality, saying that Christ is king is really a way of affirming that I know full well the world is broken and crazy, but I'm going to continue to have hope. I'm going to continue striving for peace and justice. I'm going to continue loving my neighbor as myself. Why? Because Christ is king of how I conduct my life. And that is why we have the lectionary reading we heard today from the Gospel of John. It sounds odd to hear this story the Sunday before we get into the pre-Christmas spirit, because this story is set at the end of Jesus' life, not at the beginning. It takes place as John describes the trial of Jesus on the day of his execution. Pontius Pilate, the judge in this trial, is the procurator of the Roman province of Judea, and he is not a nice person. He's scornful of the Jews who are under his civil authority. Pilate understands that the Jewish religious leaders who have insisted that Pilate be roped into their kangaroo court proceedings against Jesus, he knows that they're after one thing, really. They're not as interested in obeying Jewish religious law as much as they want to kiss up to the Romans who keep them in positions of power. They're conveniently getting rid of a thorn in their side, a rabble-rousing faith healer from the sticks named Jesus, by saying that he claims to be king, when in the Roman Empire, the only real king is Caesar himself, Emperor Tiberius. So, the Jewish religious leaders are saying, aren't we just grand for showing everyone that we appreciate the rule of Rome by turning over this troublemaker named Jesus? Pilate knows what they're up to. He's a political animal himself, and he can see that the life of Jesus, whom he could care less about personally, honestly, that life is being used as a political tool by other people who do not care about him either and want to get rid of him. Jesus is an annoyance to the status quo, and they can conveniently use Pilate to do away with him. So, as Jesus stands before him, Pilate asks, are you, as your accusers say you claim, are you the king of the Jews? But Jesus turns the tables on Pilate, saying, are you asking this, or are you asking what you've been told to ask? And that makes Pilate mad. The very idea that he could be used by anyone else. He then asks Jesus, well, what have you done to make those people so angry about you? And Jesus responds, my kingdom is not of this world. In other words, I am a king, but my kingdom does not originate here, but with God. It transcends human kingdoms. That is why we read this passage specifically on Christ the King Sunday, because it helps define what we will mean during the next month when we sing all of those great Christmas carols about the birth of Christ, the newborn King. The dynamic when it comes to Jesus is he was human, so he did live in a particular place and time in history, and he experienced everything there is to experience as a human being. Hunger, pain, laughter. Like all of us, he was defined by that, by being human. At the same time, he represented and he inhabited a way of being that went beyond human, true sacredness. And because he lived a sacred life, he is not defined by any particular place or time in history. And we have a name for that aspect of Jesus. It's a name that describes a sacred, transcendent way of being, and that name is Christ. Christ was not Jesus' last name, but a title that attempts to describe his essence, that never dies because it lives in us. An essence that he demonstrated and that we also possess within our hearts. Christ is love that lives eternally through you and me. Christ is a universal presence and a way of being that plays outside of the rules of time and place and any other human idea or limitation about how things work. At the same time, the concept of Christ and the rule of Christ is completely relatable to our lives because it presents what we hope for when this world feels hopeless. The reign of Christ is the light we seek when the world is dark. The rule of Christ is sanity and safety when this world has gone insane. And Christ the King shows up whenever fear gives way to hope, when sorrow turns into joy, when hate dissolves in the light of love. It's our way of being in the world, of navigating the world, believing that we are part of something larger, more magisterial, more lasting, more helpful and hopeful and healing than our efforts alone could ever make real. It's believing and belonging to a loving dream that is universal and timeless. It's an ideal, but through our words and deeds, it is a reality. That is the reign of Christ we celebrate today and every day. It's the kingdom where we are all citizens, and it's the place that we call home.